For 28 years, a single phrase lived in the margins of a set of military papers and nowhere else. Forest giants. It was typed into a terse 1997 report, the way someone might whisper a name in a crowded room brief. Deliberate and immediately set apart. Archivists, years later, would call the file anomalous and partially redacted. That label is a clue. The words weren't there for drama. They were there because something in those pages mattered enough to hitch a strange nickname to an otherwise routine intelligence brief. Tonight, we open that page. We will read what the report actually says, who assembled it, and why a heavily guarded military file uses phrasing hunters, loggers, and late-night campers have been muttering for decades. This isn't a ghost story told around a campfire. It's paperwork, typed observations, timestamps, and recommendations written by people whose jobs are to notice danger and document it. Paperwork carries a different kind of weight. It can be footnoted, redacted, even hidden, but it resists imagination. It leaves records. I promise you 3 things by the end of this video. First, the specific kinds of evidence the military recorded what they saw, touched, and filmed. Second, the exact areas the document marks as hotspots, the places it singled out for restriction and extra watch. Third, the reason this file was tucked away behind blacked out lines and cautious footnotes, what the authors wanted kept from public eyes, and why. We'll walk through eyewitness accounts cited by soldiers and civilian witnesses' names may be redacted, but the details remain. You'll hear about footprint casts taken by engineers, thermal frames caught from reconnaissance gear, degraded biological samples logged by a field lab, and notes about equipment interference that read like something out of a technical manual. We'll explain the strange scientific anomalies spelled out in the report. Thermal profiles that match a tall biped DNA, fragments that didn't align with known mammal databases, and repeated electromagnetic disturbances near certain clearings. We'll also reveal the practical warnings buried in the official language. The tone of those recommendations matters. Restricted access, coordinated surveillance, and strict chain of custody for any samples. Those aren't the instructions of people entertaining a legend. They're the instructions of people treating the observations as potential threats to personnel and infrastructure. If you think this is just another tall tale, stay with us because what follows is not folklore, it is paperwork, and paperwork does not lie easily. The record records. It dates things, lists observers, and gives reasons. And the pages will open, the forest's whispers are cataloged, measured, and considered serious. Tonight we will peel back the redactions enough to show you the skeleton of the case, what was seen, where it was seen, and why the government chose silence over disclosure. Listen closely. This is where rumor meets record, and the difference matters. When a phrase like forest giants sits in the margin of a military file, you don't treat it as folklore and move on. You open the file, you check the signatures, you ask who compiled it and why. That is exactly what happened with the 1997 document we're tracing tonight. This was not a forum post or an upholsterer's tall tale. It originated inside a military intelligence detachment assigned to environmental security along federally managed timberlands. The people who wrote it wore boots, checked gear, and answered to commanders responsible for safety, training, and infrastructure. The record surfaced because someone did the paperwork, right? A FOIA request unearthed the compilation, and the release came with official cover sheets and indexing. A retired operations officer who later reviewed the released material confirmed the file was genuine and described the annex as an internal compilation of auxiliary surveillance tasks from that season. In other words, these were not stray notes. This was a deliberate folder kept by a unit whose job included keeping training grounds and adjacent facilities operational and secure. What matters next is who else has looked at the material. Independent specialists in footprint analysis and primate morphology reviewed the photos and casts included in the release. These are not amateur hobbyists. They are researchers who publish in peer-reviewed journals and who work with metrics and comparative anatomy. One name in particular is relevant, Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. He is a professional anatomist who has spent years measuring and interpreting large footprint casts and hind limb mechanics. Dr. Meldrum did not write this military file, but his published work provides a technical framework that helps explain why trained observers would record a footprint carefully and why military engineers would bother to take casts and notes instead of filing the incident under animal nuisance. The composition of witnesses listed in the report is another point of credibility. The document ties accounts to people with track records, reconnaissance teams, Forestry Service law enforcement officers, and civilian logging supervisors. These were observers whose reports mattered to the military for practical reasons. A displaced fuel cache, a damaged skidder, or an unexplained sensor trip can disrupt exercises, endanger personnel, and cost money. When the people who keep roads safe and camps operating start bringing formal reports to an intelligence detachment, the chain of command listens. Context changes how you read the content. The late 1990s were a time when several training areas tightened perimeter security and increased environmental monitoring. Sensors, low altitude, flight corridors, and sensitive equipment were more common on these ranges than casual observers assume. The report frames the sightings not as campfire yarns but as operational hazards, large entities that could damage gear, trigger motion sensors, create false positives on training exercises, or interfere with aircraft at night. That operational framing is crucial. It explains why a local nickname something, hunters and loggers, might whisper, became a formalized term inside military memoranda. Finally, the language of the file is careful and bureaucratic, but not dismissive. Footnotes, cross-references, and requests for lab follow-up appear throughout. Where folklore would be speculative, the report demands evidence, casts taken by engineers, thermal frames from reconnaissance, chain of custody for biological fragments, and recommendations for restricted access. Those procedural details are the opposite of a prank. They are how institutions turn a problem they cannot explain into something they can manage. So when we approach the rest of the document, do it knowing these two facts. The people who wrote it were accountable to a chain of command, and the observations came from witnesses whose daily work put them in a position to notice real hazards. We will now move deeper into the oddities cataloged in that file: the measurements, the thermal traces, and the electronic disruptions that prompted a military unit to stop treating these incidents as local legend and start treating them as matters of security. Having established why the military treated these sightings as more than campfire stories, we need to look at the specific oddities that pushed a unit of trained observers from curiosity to concern. The authors of the 1997 file didn't scatter anecdotes, they cataloged 3 repeating anomalies that, together, make misidentification less likely and the possibility of an unknown phenomenon more plausible. First, footprint and gait consistency. Across multiple sites, the report notes impressions that are both unusually large and unusually consistent. Single-track prints measuring between 19 and 24 inches recur with a similar pressure pattern. A pronounced mid-tarsal break, deep impressions under the ball of the foot, and a long stride that, on paper, simply doesn't match bears, elk, or humans wearing heavy gear. The file includes casts taken by military engineers and reconstruction sketches by reconnaissance specialists. Those casts show dermal ridging and toe spacing that puzzled the technicians. The authors emphasized that these were not hasty roadside impressions. They were detailed, measured traces preserved with the same care the unit would give to any piece of potentially hostile evidence. Second, persistent thermal and imaging signatures. The report reproduces several night vision stills and thermal frames, some taken from the ground. One set captured from a helicopter at a distance of about 1,200 meters. Pilots and sensor techs described a vertical, bipedal thermal profile that maintained human-like proportions but scaled far larger. One pilot estimated shoulder height exceeding 7 feet. Another described a measured stride length that implied an animal standing in the 7 to 9 foot range when upright. Frame-by-frame analyses in the annex reveal a steady thermal core and limb definition that contradict blur or motion artifact. In simpler terms, these were not fleeting heat blips, they were coherent, repeatable images. Third, electromagnetic interference and equipment anomalies. Multiple logs note odd electronic behavior in proximity to observed clearings, temporary radio blackouts, sudden GPS drift by several meters, and brief failures in vehicle electronics. The report records at least one instance where all electronic instrumentation within a 3-meter radius experienced interference for intervals lasting up to 8 minutes during a logged movement. These events were not presented as anecdotes but as simultaneous, cross-checked anomalies. The moment a witness observed movement, remote sensors reported noise, and radios registered static or lost lock. For an intelligence unit, this pattern is not a curiosity. It is a vector of operational risk. Bundled with those 3 technical strands are findings that shift the file from the mechanical to the biological. The detachment documented a makeshift nest near a ridgeline and submitted hair and tissue fragments to a field lab. The samples were degraded, weathered, and partial, but the lab's notes are blunt. Sequencing returned only partial mitochondrial markers. The technician wrote in the margin that the fragments returned non-matching primate profiles and flagged the sample for extended analysis under controlled conditions. That phrase, in non-matching primate, does not mean a definitive new species. It means the profiles did not match entries in the mammalian databases available to the lab, and the result was unusual enough to merit escalation. Behavioral details in the file make the puzzle more unsettling. Witnesses describe adaptive avoidance, trail cameras that appear to have been checked and then bypassed on subsequent nights, game cameras found rotated or positioned differently with no sign of human tampering, and routes of travel that alter when surveillance is detected. In one audio clip referenced in the annex, a field team recorded rhythmic, low-frequency vocalizations that, when played back at different speeds, suggested the creature imitated simple human cadence, 3 distinct sounds that echoed a nearby call. A reconnaissance specialist's account describes a figure standing at the edge of a muskeg that, when the team called out, emitted a sequence of low tones that matched the rhythm of the call before slipping back into the trees. These are not careless attributions. They are concrete notes tied to time, place, and sensor data. A helicopter thermal capture provides perhaps the clearest single example of the anomaly, repeating across data types. According to the pilot's log, a vertical, upright shape crossed a treeless bog in deliberate, long strides. Thermal frames show a clear heat pattern: torso, limbs, head. The pilot judged the subject at 7 to 9 feet tall. Ground teams later found matching single-track prints leading into the canopy. The combination of aerial imagery, on-the-ground physical trace, and witness report forms a kind of triage an intelligence file demands before it will recommend action. Crucially, these phenomena repeat in different counties and across several seasons. The report's authors did not treat each entry as isolated. They marked patterns similar, print morphology, recurrent sensor anomalies, and recurring behavioral signatures as reasons for elevated scrutiny. Where folklore would scatter divergent stories, the document seeks clustering, the same types of events happening in separate places, observed by different kinds of witnesses, using different instruments that nonetheless return similar results. That triangulation is what moved the file from curiosity to protocol. Technical teams flagged samples for further lab work, reconnaissance suggested covert monitoring, and the operations section began drawing maps of hotspots. Before we read the key passages of the report itself, keep these 3 threads in mind: consistent footprints in gait, reproducible, thermal, and imaging evidence, and electronic interference paired with behavioral sophistication, because together they form the skeletal framework of the document's concern. Open the report and you find a short, crisp file header: November 1997, Intelligence Annex, Environmental Security Detachment. What follows is not gossip or a patrolman's notebook. It is a formal record that catalogs 13 incidents over 3 years, and then, crucially, singles out a subset, the author's label, Forest Giants. That label is applied only where 3 conditions are met: a reliable witness, a physical trace, and corroborating instrument data. Those thresholds are strict because the writers knew that extraordinary claims require layered proof. The first set of entries deals with footprints, and they are not ordinary. Multiple sites show single-track impressions measuring between 19 and 24 inches. The prints are not a scattered mess. They form clear, directed tracks with an extended stride that does not fit a bare shuffling or a large ungulate. Field engineers making casts recorded a pronounced mid-tarsal break, a flex in the foot that suggests a human-like arch acting differently than a plantigrade animal. The casts show dermal ridging and pressure patterns inconsistent with known species, heel-toe-toe loading that indicates upright bipedal locomotion, and a weight distribution signaling a heavily muscled posterior. In plain language, the prints look like a very large, very heavy person, but the proportions don't match any known human. Thermal and imaging evidence appears next, and it is the kind of data that pushes this file from local rumor into the realm of technical reporting. Reconnaissance teams with night vision and thermal gear captured frames of a vertical, upright thermal profile crossing open bog and ridge lines. One helicopter pilot's log, referenced with timestamps and grid coordinates, describes a subject judged at 7 to 9 feet tall, moving with long, deliberate strides. The thermal sequences show a clear torso, limbs, and head silhouette. Frame-by-frame analysis in the annex notes shoulder height well above 7 feet and a mass distribution suggesting dense musculature rather than fat or loose spur, the kind of detail that comes from careful measurement, not speculation. Biological material is where the report becomes most unsettling to scientists. Several entries list hair and tissue fragments recovered from a makeshift nest found along a ridge. The samples arrived at the field lab degraded, yet technicians could extract mitochondrial markers. The sequencing logs are blunt, non-matching primate profile, and novel markers detected. The report does not claim discovery. It notes limitations and recommends further, controlled analysis in specialized facilities. Still, the language is precise. The genetics did not match databases for known local mammals, and the analysts flagged the samples for extended, guarded study. Electronic and sensor anomalies recur through the document like a second signature. Multiple communications logs record temporary radio blackouts and erratic GPS drift when teams entered certain clearings. One entry states that all electronic instrumentation within a 300-meter radius experienced interference for periods up to 8 minutes during an observed movement. The interference was not constant background noise. It correlated with human and instrument observations. That temporal linkage sensor disruption aligned with the sighting is the kind of correlation intelligence officers note as operationally relevant. Behavioral descriptions tie these physical anomalies together into something more than an animal. Witnesses from varied backgrounds, military reconnaissance, civilian loggers, forestry rangers describe patterns that suggest awareness and, at times, intent. Vehicles and equipment left in the open were found dismantled or displaced in ways that observers described as too deliberate to be attributed to scavengers. Several reports document avoidance behaviors, creatures that alter routes to evade cameras, that appear to recognize observation and then withdraw. And, chillingly, one audio clip included in the annex captures a sequence of low-frequency tones that mirror the rhythm of a human call made by a specialist. In another account, an enlisted reconnaissance specialist describes approaching a figure that emitted 3 distinct low-frequency vocalizations before retreating, seeming to mimic the cadence of the human caller. These are not solitary, hyperbolic witnesses. The accounts are cross-referenced with timestamps, sensor logs, and physical traces. The report's final pages reveal the operational response and the reason much of this file would later be redacted. Recommendations are procedural and pragmatic. Restrict civilian access to mapped hotspots, increase covert surveillance using motion-triggered and thermal cameras, deploy acoustic recorders tuned to low frequencies, and coordinate with academic labs for rigorous biomolecular testing. The file cautions against direct interaction, no baiting, no feeding, no amateur collection of samples, citing past incidents where baiting produced damaged equipment and compromised data. Importantly, the annex advises maintaining a tight chain of custody for any biological material and limiting public dissemination until the cause, origin, and threat level can be properly assessed. It is that last point that explains the secrecy. The authors explicitly argue for delayed release of details while further analysis is conducted and operational risks are evaluated. Redactions and restricted annexes, the report notes, serve 2 purposes: protect ongoing monitoring efforts and prevent public interference that could contaminate evidence or provoke hazardous encounters. In short, the document does not ask to be believed. It asks to be treated like a working intelligence file, documented, guarded, and acted upon. Open those pages and the paper itself becomes the evidence. Footprints that defy simple explanation, thermal frames that show a vertical silhouette taller than any known wild hominid, degraded biological fragments that return unfamiliar genetic markers, and instruments that die in proximity. Together they form a pattern. The report names that pattern forest giants, not as folklore, but as a category meeting the report's hard criteria. What the annex records is not proof in the courtroom sense, but it is proof in the bureau sense. Repeatable, cross-verified anomalies that demanded action and, ultimately, secrecy. If the first half of the file tells us what was seen, the second half tells us what to do about it, and those instructions change everything for people who live, work, or travel in the valleys and ridgelines. The report names. The document singles out 3 mapped locales as priority sites: a narrow ridge above the Muskeg Hollow, a series of cedar-lined valley pockets along the river bend, and a high plateau of logged-over regrowth near a former training ground. Those places are not poetic descriptions. They are grid-referenced coordinates tied to repeated physical traces, thermal signatures, and instrument anomalies. The recommendation is blunt and operational. Restrict access, increase covert observation, and treat every trace as potential scientific evidence. Surveillance, the report insists, must be layered and quiet. Motion-triggered video was recommended as the baseline, stills and short clips that record movement without human presence, but paired with thermal images capable of long-duration recording through the night. Acoustic recorders are stressed for a reason. Several witnesses in one field, recording captured low-frequency vocalizations outside normal mammal bands. The annex advises arrays of subsonic-capable microphones set in different elevations to triangulate source and note temporal patterns. Aerial assets are marked, or coverter, suggested for periodic sweeps, mainly to confirm repeat occupancy and to map transit corridors the animals appear to use. Cameras, the report notes, should be camouflaged and avoid scent contamination. Batteries and storage must be kept in locked, numbered containers to maintain chain of custody. Mitigation is practical and, at times, stark. The report recommends temporary militarized perimeter control around hotspots during high activity. Windows and formal notices to civilian agencies and industry operators to avoid leaving equipment unattended. It explicitly forbids baiting or attempts to lure animals with food or noise because past baiting attempts produced only displaced or damaged supplies, ruined scientific opportunity, and the risk of habituation. It forbids amateur collection of samples, instructing that any biological material for tissue fragments or nest detritus be handled only by trained personnel in controlled conditions. The reason is simple. Contamination destroys value. The lab results already in the file were degraded and partial. But even those fragments showed markers the technicians labeled non-matching or novel. Contaminated material would be scientifically worthless and could mislead analyses that might otherwise be decisive. Documentation is treated as the other half of mitigation. The file sets exacting rules. Every print, hair, or audio clip must be photographed with a visible scale, GP, stamped, and time-stamped by a device with synced metadata. If a cast is taken, its chain of custody must be logged immediately: who handled it, when, how it was stored, and where it was moved. The report repeats, in bureaucratic but unmistakable language, that fragmented, poorly documented samples are the enemy of discovery. The aim is not to keep information secret for secrecy's sake. The aim is to preserve evidence until analysis can separate noise from signal. Embedded witness accounts in this section give practical weight to those logging foreman found a skidder assembly dismantled and arranged in a semicircle near a clearing parts, stacked and propped as if left deliberately, not as the result of simple scavenging. A ranger cataloged abrasion marks at head height on a series of trees repeated patterned and aligned along a path the animals seemed to use as a boundary marker. A helicopter crew chief described flying low over a stand of regrowth only to have a stationary figure step into a small opening and stare directly at the aircraft for nearly a minute. Broad shoulders, a pronounced brow, and a gait the pilot sketched later as unlike any bear or large ungulate they had seen. These are not colorful asides. They are the operational evidence that justified restricting access and closing the area to casual traffic. There is a second, quieter thread in the recommendations. Treat the phenomenon as a potential threat to operations. The report repeatedly notes incidents where electronics misbehaved, radios blacking out for minutes, GPS coordinates drifting, vehicle electronics resetting without cause when teams entered certain clearings. For a military planner with responsibility for training grounds and sensitive installations, those are not curiosities. They are vulnerabilities. This is the explicit logic behind the redactions and restricted annexes. If an unknown organism can induce sensor failures in predictable zones, releasing detailed hot zone coordinates without protective measures could enable interference with operations or expose civilians to danger. Finally, the report frames a longer-term program. Observe quietly, gather rigorously, and only then decide on wider disclosure or action. The advice is not indefinite secrecy, but methodical accumulation of evidence, covert monitoring until biological questions can be answered and a defensible policy formed. In practice, that meant authorized labs would inventory any collected material, operational teams would maintain surveillance patterns, and civilian advisories would be issued only when safety plans were in place. It is a cautious, bureaucratic approach, one that prioritizes preserving the integrity of the evidence and minimizing risk over immediate public alarm. Taken together, the recommendations imply something important. Whoever drafted this annex believed the encounters were real enough to merit dedicated resources and careful handling, and serious enough to warrant temporary restriction of public access. That calculus explains why the file was folded into restricted sections and why parts of it were later redacted, not to hide the fact of observation, but to protect an ongoing effort to document, analyze, and manage a phenomenon that, if left poorly handled, could become a safety liability and a scientific loss. The report's solution is not confrontation. It is containment, documentation, and patient inquiry, steps any credible agency would take when faced with evidence that resists simple explanation. What the 1997 file makes clear is simple. Treat this as a problem for careful eyes and careful hands, not a campfire story. If the evidence in that annex touches your backyard, your workplace, or the routes you hike, here are concrete steps you can take right now, actions that mirror the report's own logic of documentation, containment, and responsible reporting. First, find the paper. Use the FOIA accession number listed in the Declassified Index Report 97MILENVFT and request any associated annexes or lab attachments. Don't rely on casual keyword searches. Cite the exact report number, dates 1994 to 1997, and any page or exhibit numbers you see in the initial release. If pages are redacted, note their file designators and include those identifiers in a follow-up FOIA. Requests that point to specific file IDs and exhibit numbers tend to travel faster through the bureaucratic maze. Ask explicitly for lab logs, chain of custody forms, and internal communications around the November 1997 monitoring effort. Those are the documents that explain why parts of the file were withheld and which labs handled biological materials. Second, preserve traces the right way. If you encounter a print, hair, nest, or audio clip, do not touch. Photograph everything first. Wide shots for context, mid-range shots to show scale and surroundings, and close-ups with a ruler or measuring tape in frame. Record GPS coordinates and timestamp your images. Most smartphones write metadata into photos automatically, but note it down separately in a notebook or voice memo in case metadata is stripped. For physical material, wear disposable gloves and place samples in clean paper envelopes. Plastic can trap moisture and degrade DNA. Label each sample with the date, time, location, and your name. Log witnesses with names and contact details, and record their first-hand statements as soon as you can while memories are fresh. This chain of documentation is exactly what the military report demanded. Without it, samples and sightings lose scientific weight. Third, gather technology that matters. The report recommended motion-triggered video and acoustic recording specifically tuned to low-frequency sounds. If you're able, deploy quality trail cameras set to record video with clear timestamps and position them to cover game trails, clearings, and ridgelines identified in local reports. Acoustic recorders should be set to capture low-frequency bands and saved with high-quality settings. Even a single clear audio clip that shows mimicry or low-frequency calls can shift the sighting from anecdote to data point. If you lack equipment, partner with universities, local naturalist societies, or vetted researchers who don't put yourself or others at risk trying to become a covert field team overnight. Fourth, notify the right people. Submit verified reports to established organizations that track these phenomena groups like the Bigfoot Field Researchers. Organization BFRO maintain databases and can cross-reference sightings. Reach out to academic researchers who study large footprint morphology or primate anatomy. Mention Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum's work as a framework the military file itself indirectly referenced. Provide them with the same careful documentation the report asks for: time-stamped photos, coordinate-stamped videos, raw audio files, and notes on sensor anomalies. Researchers can advise on sample handling, arrange vetted lab analysis, and help ensure your material is preserved for proper testing. Fifth, push for more records. If the initial FOIA returns redacted annexes or references to lab work, file a supplemental request demanding specific categories: lab inventory logs, mitochondrial sequencing files, chain of custody documentation, and the communications traffic that accompanied the 1997 monitoring. Be persistent and precise. Bureaucracies respond to documentation just as the military did. If statutes allow, request unredacted copies and explain why transparency serves public safety and scientific inquiry. Finally, stay safe and do no harm. The report is emphatic. Do not attempt to feed, lure, chase, or otherwise provoke these animals. If a sighting occurs, withdraw to a safe distance, secure witnesses, and document from afar. Avoid contaminating potential evidence. The point of the military's advice was not secrecy for its own sake. It was preservation of life, of evidence, and of whatever unknown organism these files describe. Follow these steps and you convert a rumor into a record. The report's logic is clear. Careful observation, rigorous documentation, and coordinated reporting are the only reliable path to answers. If enough citizens, researchers, and institutions follow that path, the remaining redactions will become harder to justify. The force may hold its secrets, but the paperwork shows a way in and collective. Methodical action is how we pry that door open. The 1997 document changes the conversation in one simple but profound way. It moves the story from campfire lore into the realm of official record. When trained observers, laboratory technicians, and military planners put footprints, thermal frames, and fragmentary tissue into a formal report and labeled a pattern forest giants, they did more than note an oddity. They created a paper trail that demands explanation. Look at what the files actually show. We are not dealing with a single strange night or an opportunistic misread. The report compiles repeated cross-checked data. Single-track prints far larger than any local ungulate with pressure patterns suggesting upright walking. Thermal images showing tall vertical profiles with shoulder heights above 7 feet. Biological fragments that returned partial non-matching sequences. And consistent eyewitness testimony from people whose jobs depend on reading the landscape correctly. Those elements, taken together, are what pushed the military to treat the problem as operationally significant rather than folkloric. That significance explains the tone of the document and the redactions that followed. The report explicitly frames these encounters as hazards to equipment, personnel, and mission security. It recommends restricted access, covert monitoring, and controlled laboratory analysis. Those are sensible, precautionary steps, but they have another consequence. When a file is folded into security procedures, public visibility shrinks. Redactions are not always about hiding a sensation. They are often about buying time to understand a potential threat without creating panic or inviting contamination of crucial evidence. Still, secrecy breeds questions. Which sections were redacted and why? What did the lab mean by novel markers? Who made the call to limit distribution? Those questions are not idle curiosities. They are exactly the kinds of gaps that civil oversight and scientific inquiry exist to fill. If you live, work, or travel near the hotspots named in the file, the document gives you a clear, practical stance. Treat encounters as data points, not trophies. Do not approach, do not bait. Document. The chain of custody and contamination warnings are not bureaucratic theater. They are the difference between a sample that can be analyzed and one that is dismissed. Simple steps matter. GPS-stamped photos, uncompressed audio files, time-coded video, and clear notes about environmental conditions and witness positions. When evidence is handled properly, it becomes useful to researchers and harder for authorities to dismiss. There is also a civic step. The FOIA path that produced the declassified portions of this report worked because someone pushed, asked for specifics, and kept asking. If you find redacted pages or references to annexes and lab logs, file follow-up requests. Demand the lab inventories, the sequencing data, and the chain of custody forms. Request the communications traffic that accompanied the monitoring effort. Be precise with file numbers and patient with bureaucratic time. Transparency rarely comes without persistence. We must also insist on scientific rigor. Reach out to established researchers who work on large footprint morphology and primate anatomy. Share time-stamped geolocated material with qualified labs and field organizations. The goal is not sensational headlines. It is reproducible, verifiable analysis. If the markers are truly novel, independent science will find them. If they are contamination or misreadings, objective testing will show that too. Either way, the truth moves forward through disciplined method and shared evidence. Finally, remember what the papers prove and what they cannot. The files show that trained observers saw things that left measurable traces, and they show that a military body took those observations seriously enough to invest resources. The papers do not, by themselves, answer origin or intent. They do not give us a neat classification or a final cause. What they do give us is leverage, an official admission that unexplained, repeatable anomalies occurred and were worthy of controlled study. So, act with caution and with resolve. Document carefully, push for the remaining records, support legitimate researchers, and press your representatives for transparency where public safety and scientific interests align. The forest may keep its giants in the trees, but it cannot erase paper. Records can be subpoenaed, cross-referenced, and analyzed. Paper, unlike canopy, is peelable. The most important question is no longer rhetorical. Not do they exist, but how much longer will parts of the record remain hidden? If the 1997 file teaches anything, it is that observation was already happening by professionals, across disciplines, with evidence left on the ground. The next step is collective. Insist that the same care the military demanded in documenting these occurrences be applied by scientists and by the public. Do that, and the truth will not be hidden by redactions forever. Transparency rarely comes without persistence. The next steps need to be organized, practical, and relentless, because paperwork that sat sealed for decades will only be unpeeled by people who know how to press. First, act like a scientist and a journalist at once. If you find a print, a hair tuft, or a thread of tissue, treat it as evidence, not a trophy. Put on gloves, photograph the item in place with a scale and a GPS tag device, then collect the material using sterile tweezers into clean, sealable tubes or paper envelopes. Avoid plastic if you suspect contamination from moisture. Label everything immediately with date, time, coordinates, and collector name. Keep samples cool and hand them, intact, to a qualified lab or a vetted researcher as soon as possible. Digital files matter just as much. Preserve raw video and audio files, and never edit or compress originals. Metadata, the invisible timestamp and geolocation attached to a file, is often what turns a curious find into admissible science. Second, build a coalition. Individual reports mean little when they live in isolation. Reach out to reputable organizations and academics, university primatology departments, wildlife forensics labs, and nonprofit field groups that maintain rigorous databases. Share your materials under clear chain of custody agreements. The 1997 file's insistence on controlled analysis wasn't red tape for its own sake. It's how novel results survive scrutiny. A networked approach also discourages hoaxes. Multiple independent verifications across disciplines reduce the chance that a single bad actor can derail the truth-seeking process. Third, modern tools make serious documentation accessible. Affordable thermal cameras, acoustic recorders capable of capturing low-frequency sounds, and drones with stabilized imaging let citizen observers collect agency-grade evidence if used correctly. Learn the basics, calibrate your devices, sync clocks to standard time, and keep logs of deployment conditions. Use multiple sensors when possible. A thermal frame, a visual camera, and a microphone together are far more persuasive than a single, shaky video. Fourth, continue the paper chase. File follow-up FOIAs citing the accession number report 97MILENVFT and the specific annexes referenced in the declassified text. If pages remain redacted, appeal. Involve local representatives and oversight bodies. Congressional staffers and inspectors general can prod agencies to release records that standard FOIA channels leave sealed. Public pressure matters, petitions, coordinated inquiries, and media coverage focused on the document's operational concerns, safety, infrastructure interference, and unexplained biological samples can shift the risk calculus for agencies that prefer secrecy. Fifth, demand scientific standards. Encourage labs to publish methods and negative controls alongside any findings. Novel markers are only meaningful when contamination, human error, and database gaps have been ruled out. If independent labs confirm unusual genetic material, the result must be replicable and peer-reviewed before it becomes a claim. That discipline protects the investigation from sensationalism and builds a robust case for disclosure. Finally, stay safe and skeptical. The report's operational tone was clear. Avoid confrontation. If you encounter a large bipedal creature or unexplained activity, withdraw, document, and report. Do not bait, chase, or publicly advertise the location. Keep witnesses together and consistent in their statements. The report shows that measured discretion both protects people and preserves evidence. This is not a call for vigilante science or for headlines. It is a blueprint for turning a redacted footnote in a military file into a public, verifiable inquiry. The paper proves someone took these anomalies seriously. Now it's our job to match that seriousness with method, cooperation, and pressure. Records can be peeled back, labs can test, representatives can ask hard questions if enough people commit to proper documentation and persistent inquiry. What was once hidden by redaction may yet be forced into daylight, and with it, a clearer answer about the giants the forest keeps.